welcome to this year's Polyglot Global Conference 2021. And I just want to say thank you to Mr. Richard Simca for allowing me to be a part of this amazing lineup yet again. And if you are someone with any form of hearing disability, you can totally go ahead and click on the closed captions to watch the rest of this video. To proceed to my presentation for today, I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. And there we go. So the topic that I will discuss today is language learning and the atypical brain, history, intervention, and integration in classroom. And to present the grounds that we are going to cover today by researching the classroom policies around the world, this paper aims to establish a history of undermining the students with special needs in a classroom setting, which draws attention to statistically relevant details that provide inclusive language learning or putting people at an unfair disadvantage due to their pre-existing or developmental conditions. And by researching those details, we're also, in association with that detail, going to cover different forms of interventions sought to help them for better integration in an academic environment. And finally, we will move to a descriptive analysis of language disorders and different selective neurodegenerative diseases to talk about how we can further combat demotivation and pipeline alienation of disability in classroom setting. And before we get into more details about those clinical aspects for this conversation, I wanted to talk about what is learning. Learning has been defined as a cognitive system by Hora, Gerard, and colleagues that acquires information through regular practice or memorization in independent context. So you actually collected responses about the perception of learning from students, and they came under the following categories. For example, learning as a quantitative increase in knowledge, learning as acquiring information, procuring information for the first time in this case, learning as memorizing, storing information that can be reproduced. So in this case, we are talking about the automatization, learning as acquiring skills and methods that can be retained and used as necessary. So the functionality of learning, learning as making sense or abstracting meaning, relating parts of the subject matter to each other. So this is talking about the network that we can establish in terms of learning, and learning as interpreting and understanding reality in a different way. So this is about the meta-linguistic perception. And learning styles happen to be categorized for the process of acquiring information as well. And Manieri, Frozza, and colleagues discussed that the educational systema is composed of a modular triad. The Dominion module, the adaptive module, and the student module happen to be relevant for this conversation, but to be more specific, the adaptive module happens to be the most relevant one for this discussion in particular, because we're going to cover the cognitive and learning style in this context. And the seminal work of writing in Chima covers the concepts of performance with information in the following ways. So as you guys can clearly see, the verbal imagery and the holistic analytical skills have been distinctively differentiated in this diagram. The reason being verbal imagery corresponds to the tactile senses as opposed to the holistic analytical processing based on cognitive functions. And this association based on perceptual models of learning channels through which students take in information through the following ways, such as visual learners, auditory learners, and kinesthetic and tactile learners. This categorization happens to be only existent according to Chick, because of they are associated channels that allow students to procure information from, and they're not really learning methods, and they are not supposed to be guiding students in a particular way, or students are not supposed to follow them in a particular way when it comes to procuring information from exposed content. And now we're going to cover the history of academic segregation for DOD individuals. And obviously, different reports of segregation of children with learning disabilities is not uncommon throughout the history. Moreover, they were not really a part of the mainstream population, you could say. They were placed in asylums, and they did not really receive the help that they needed with their social cultural intellectuality. And although the research on DLD represents a prime subject of learning disability, the global policies were not really unified with a set list of DLDs that needed special attention, which is ultimately the reason why it resulted into focusing on sensory disability and progressing eventually over what we know as learning differences for specific individuals today. The early 19th century embraced the education of the deaf and blind children in the United States. but the misconception about these disabilities being contagious, being able to harm other people, harm other students in this context, remain in the classroom. In 1975, with the passing of the Public Law 94-142, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act ushered in a new element of disability representation in US academia. In June 1994, the World Conference on Special Needs Education was held in Salamanca, Spain, and their agreement was based on an inclusive environment where integrative representation was featured as a mandate. And for India, Sanjeevan Kumar reported that from the demographic of children between 4 to 16 years of age, 90% of the population until the 1990s were excluded from the mainstream education. And even though the concept of integrated education did surface in India around the mid-1950s, the National Policy on Education in 1986 and the Program of Action in 1992 finally established the need for the integration of children with special needs with general groups. And now we are moving on to learning methods and caregiver guides when it comes to language disorders and neurodegenerative diseases. And I just wanted to mention that since our conversation is contextually based on learning languages or what are the challenges of not being able to based on atypical conditions, we will limit our conversation in the realm of neurology and cognitive fields. And to talk about DLD, Krishnan and Watkins and colleagues commented on developmental language disorder or language delay as a type of disorder that would hinder the language proficiency in children who have no hearing loss or other disorders that could potentially explain why they're performing the way they are when it comes to a typical brain. And a report from NIDCD in 2013 demonstrated that 7 to 8% of children in kindergarten is affected by DLD as the most common childhood learning disability, as our understanding of brain development during the early school years is constantly evolving. We can explore how the role of educational experiences can be conditioning the brain structure and function. And in this regard, PEW Trend Magazine reported a study where researchers used MRI imaging to collect pictures of the brains of the learners who are struggling readers as tested on a dyslexic range and as receivers of intensive tutoring. And the collection of the brain scans from every 2 weeks confirmed noticeable changes in reading skills and changes in the structural brain scan of the white matter tracts as well. So that kind of confirms that the learning habits do change the cognitive functionality and the brain as we know it. And although scientific research is the only way assigned to us to combat the public isolation of the target population, in order to confirm that discrimination against the individuals with different learning disabilities still persists, a BBC report titled Children with Learning Disabilities Failed by Society collected commentaries from Professor Marmot about the estimated passing of the population at hand is 15 to 20 years prior than regular people due to poor housing, low income, social isolation, bullying, etc. And in addition to that detail, 40% of the population with learning difficulties do not receive any diagnosis in their childhood. Apart from being subjected to hate crimes, people with learning disabilities are often misconceived as people who cannot live independently or work independently, as reported by Williams in The Guardian. And to go on to the clinical side of this context, Ockwitz actually claimed that the neurodevelopmental bias for dyslexia, the caregiving environment, and the psychological development do have a correlation in between them. And moreover, these associations do establish a neurological deficit that increases the inability to process information when an overstimulation is underway. And this inability to process information, multiple information at the same time, you could say that too, is attributed to working memory deficit, as documented by Professor Vander in 2017. Difficulties in terms of understanding an opaque orthography happens to be a common feature exhibited in this discourse as well. And when it comes to foreign language learning with dyslexia, it can be tackled with building phonological awareness and sound letter correspondences, as reported by Neil Koska, for example. Short and long vowel comparison is based on an aid that allows for keywords with short vowel sounds written on a paper or on the board. Then the students are asked to transcribe them phonetically. And finally, they are asked to find other words to match the short vowels. And additionally, students are also given flashcards where they have words written with different diphthongs. For example, I, this sound, with different spellings. And they are given words that would contain this diphthong to read. And for morphological awareness, they can well, expect supportive activities based on creating word families or word chains or word web, such as re-educate, education, etc. So breaking down these morphemes and creating a network of these morphemes actually. And finally, grammatical awareness improvement is based on improving the analyzation skills of different constituents that make up a whole sentence. And in this case, color coding different parts of the whole speech can show increased learning, and it has been proven that it is effective in this regard. And now we are going into the contextual differences based on neurodegenerative diseases and the impact of language learning associated with it. Okay, so before we go into more description and the targeted topics that we are going to cover eventually, the term needs a bit of explaining. So the term neurodegenerative disease, it does have a connotation behind it, which does coincide with its incurable progressive degeneration of the structure and function of the central or peripheral nervous system in terms of heterogeneous diseases. So it's an amalgamation of diseases that are not really stoppable in any sense. And the first one that we have is aphasia, which has been commonly described as a brain injury causing language impairment, affecting the comprehension and production of speech and the way people read and write. And the most common types of aphasia happen to be the following ones: global aphasia, mixed transcortical aphasia, Broca's aphasia, transcortical motor aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, anomic aphasia, etc. And this picture actually shows that depending on the fluency, comprehension, and repetition, they do have different associations. And neurolinguistic research actually facilitated functional neuroimaging with word generation tasks on patients with brain damage. And you and colleagues actually commented on how neuroimaging with on lexical semantics is becoming more and more popular these days. This is shown with evidences from fluent and non-fluent aphasia patients. And these effects are connected to an extensive network, which includes the temporal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, the left frontal gyrus, the left temporal gyrus, and the left frontal temporal gyrus, and the cingulated cortex. And Kenny's workbook on aphasia actually contains multiple tasks to engage the brain into higher cognitive functions based on theoretical tasks, actually. And reports from aphasia.org also confirm that therapy dog or emotional support dog and music therapy can also prove extreme efficiency with no known side effects for this treatment. And when it comes to Alzheimer's, it has been discussed as a disease that has progressive or worsening effects in multiple cognitive faculties, including language, actually, basically. And Ferris and Farlow claim, based on the language-centric elements of cognitive competence, multiple language-specific scales have been identified to analyze the progression of the disease, how far it is for impacting, in terms of impacting the patient. For example, in severe cases, severe impairment battery, or SIB, can be used to evaluate the language orientation, concentration, visual spatial ability, practice memory, etc. And this image actually shows that the impact associated with the progression of Alzheimer's on different forms of cognitive functions. So the mild Alzheimer's would possibly show up with forgetfulness, short-term memory loss in the patients. Moderate Alzheimer's manifests itself in terms of aphasia and transitions in care. And the severe ones probably would impact people based on agitation and altered sleep patterns, etc. And all I wanted to say in terms of the rehab facilities for Alzheimer's is that people have to be more patient when they have to diagnose a patient with Alzheimer's, and do not infantilize them, treat them as regular people. That kind of helps to start a conversation and maintain a conversation with them. We can skip over this because we have kind of touched upon the effects of early stage and moderate to severe stage Alzheimer's based on different cognitive functions. And eventually we have to cover Parkinson's disease because this has been documented as the speech and communication problem, which includes problems with adjusting the volume of the voice and a holistic difficulty with speech and the voice associated with unsteady voice qualities and flatness of the voice and lack of depth control, etc. And for the speech pathology treatment, when it comes to Parkinson's disease, Parkinson.net actually defines the target domains for treating Parkinson's disease in 3 categories. difficulty with speech, hypokinetic dysarthria, and the influence of cognitive impairments on language comprehension, language use, and communication skills, difficulty with chewing and swallowing dysgraphia, choking and slow chewing and swallowing, and final difficulty with controlling saliva, drooling or dribbling of saliva. And CDC actually covers the topic of Down syndrome in greater detail than I was able to find any other resource on Down syndrome. So they have defined the Down syndrome aspect of clinical state as a genetic disorder that would manifest in individuals with an extra copy of the chromosome. And this determines how a baby's body would form and function as it grows in the course of pregnancy and following the birth. And National Down Syndrome Society mentions that Down syndrome creates different grounds of strengths and challenges in the course of communication skills and the overall development of children, basically. And this includes receptive and productive elements of language and language skills and reading. And for the required clinical help, physicians treat ear, nose, and throat conditions. Ear because they tend to accumulate a lot of earwax, and also metabolic and hormonal concerns that target respiration, hearing, voice, and articulation. And since school learning is based on languages, special educators and speech language pathology help them with modifying language, and they also come up with curriculum to help children learn. And parents also play a key figure in this discourse because home and daily activities happen to be the fundamentals of communication for any human being. So that is pretty understandable. And when it comes to inclusive pedagogy for disability, Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Disability Education and Training has laid out common sense, inclusive policies for individuals with different kinds of disability that do cover mobility, psychological learning, and medical issues. By reflecting on the grounds of previous educational experiences, they suggest that although there are individuals who might have developed effective academic skills, there could be people who are just coming into terms with their disability because they were not diagnosed previously. So there is no, even playing field in this regard. And in terms of teaching format, there are differential aspects that confirm the participation will be based on exclusively based on targeting the space when it comes to lab work or any type of practical operation. For foreign language learning, Delfino and Lombardio have identified an aspect that they term as global areas of language paralysis, which covers the fundamentals of language learning in terms of memorization, anxiety, and grammar confusion. And for the memorization of nouns, they suggest that the instructor should provide a color coding system with index cards. They could be pink for feminine nouns, blue for masculine nouns, and yellow for neuter nouns. Just suggestions, don't have to start spitballing ideas. In order to help them recall the meaning of nouns, the teacher should also introduce the vocabulary in a specific context. And additionally, they can be using post-it notes. And for grammar rules, it is suggestive that they use mnemonics. And for the conversation about students' anxiety, in order to combat that, students' affective filter needs to be lowered for maximum efficiency when it comes to second language learning in general. And this entails creating an anxiety-free learning environment by putting posters of landscapes and cities of the target culture, and positive affirmations about the second language also help in this regard. And the arrangement of the chairs could be in the form of semicircle instead of rows to engage them more in conversations. And to handle the fear of grammar and making mistakes, the instructor is suggested to use humor and to make the sentences funny, basically, to make them learn easier, make them learn things more easily, you could say. And subsequently, pointing out the problems of particular aspects of grammar, the students will start to remember the rules. And generally, they will find it hard to remember the rules, and because of the overstimulation of the grammatical terminologies associated with language learning in general, they would tend to forget the concept in general. But to eradicate the lexical and grammar confusion, the instructor should demonstrate grammar by using multimodality devices and reduce the usage of traditional terminology with no explanation. And that helps them to remember concepts in a better way. And to conclude, learning a language shall not disbar anybody based on their non-traditional abilities, because there are policymakers who are setting expected outcomes, because this should be based on equity. And it is a known fact that our society does promote ableist superiority, but to eradicate the practice of subhumanization, teaching in terms of languages, teaching techniques in terms of languages should be targeted to combat disenfranchisement for the inclusive value that academia upholds. And these are my references. And I wanted to say thank you for coming to my presentation. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And thank you so much for coming once again.